This has been a very, very warm welcome, and everything is very well organized at Rutgers, so you guys are amazing. Thank you. I was like, can someone come organize my life? Who organized this? Because it doesn't look as seamless and structured. Thank you so much for having me. So I wanted to spend some time here situating how I think we got here in terms of the legal attacks on trans bodies, how I would describe where here is, where I think we're going, and then what we can do about it. But I also really want to leave a lot of time for us to talk together and strategize about different ideas and answer your questions. So hopefully you'll stick around for the Q&A so we can be in dialogue with each other. So how did we get here? In some sense, we've always been here, and that's really important for me to acknowledge at the outset, in a battle between a mythic idea of what our country is and what it actually is. Fearing a looming constitutional crisis, but witnessing the Constitution fail to uphold basic promises for so many every day. In many ways, we have always been in a constitutional crisis, or at least a crisis over the meaning of our Constitution. This is not the first time that our system of checks and balances have failed to check dangerous incursions into people's bodily autonomy, safety, and freedom. That doesn't mean that this particular moment is not uniquely precarious. I think that it is. But I also don't think it serves us to exceptionalize aspects of what we are witnessing. Under our constitutional structure, we have maintained systems of chattel slavery, of internment, of special registration, of militarized policing, and of de jure segregation. All of that is to say, when we think about how we got here, it can be helpful to remember the ways we've always been here. It can be helpful to remember that we have always been operating within systems that legitimize arbitrary acts of governmental violence and discrimination. For me, recognizing this doesn't drive me towards nihilism. Instead, it helps me to calibrate each of our advocacy interventions to the reality of what we're up against and informed by decades and sometimes centuries of work. In terms of the recent structural and cultural attacks on trans and non-binary people, even though the history preceding these contemporary attacks dates back centuries, looking at the past decade or so is instructive for understanding how we arrived at this particular moment. So in 2013, at the end of June, the Supreme Court decided 2 cases in 1 week that shaped the contours of the decade that followed. The first was United States versus Windsor. In United States versus Windsor, the Supreme Court struck down the federal so-called Defense of Marriage Act. And this was the law that Bill Clinton signed in 1996 that defined marriage as between one man and one woman for all federal purposes. And the court struck it down on the ground that it violated the due process and equal protection rights of same-sex couples. Windsor was, of course, hailed by many as a major victory for justice and equality. But the other significant case decided that week was Shelby County versus Holder. In Shelby County, that same Supreme Court gutted central provisions of the Voting Rights Act. And while many white-led LGBT legal organizations unambiguously celebrated that week as a turning point for justice, every formal equality gain was immediately put into jeopardy by the court's decision in Shelby County, which had been largely ignored by these mainstream and well-funded LGBT organizations. After the court's decision in Shelby County, state legislatures immediately got to work enacting restrictions on voting, gerrymandering their state legislatures, and passing draconian anti-immigrant, anti-abortion, and anti-trans measures. Meanwhile, the mainstream LGBT legal movement doubled down on its investment in marriage equality to the exclusion of other work that focused on building power and security for the entire community. It was a long-standing and growing problem, top-down civil rights movements. Between 2013 and 2015, the LGBT legal movement resources were almost exclusively funneled towards litigating challenges to the remaining state-level bans on marriage equality using the Supreme Court's logic from Windsor. It was an effective strategy for building capital and inclusion for a subset of gay people, but it did little to transform the material conditions of many in the LGBT community. This strategy also failed to account for the obvious and immediate backlash that would follow from further legal successes on behalf of cis gay people. While power and resources were growing for some white cis gay people, the rest of the community was largely neglected within the mainstream movement and especially vulnerable to backlash. And like many civil rights movement, this strategy over-relied on legal change while underinvesting in community building. So then in 2015, the Supreme Court strikes down the remaining bans on marriage equality for same-sex couples in Obergefell v. Hodges. And that, too, was hailed as a major victory for civil rights, and in many ways it was. But while LGBT legal organizations were celebrating, and some organizations were even declaring victory and shutting down entirely, our opponents were quickly pivoting and preparing to build tools to attack us on multiple fronts. And then, in the immediate aftermath of Obergefell, a global, well-resourced, right-wing movement swiftly took aim at trans people, building a communications and political machine that situated us as a threat to others. Meanwhile, instead of fighting these attacks head-on, our leading legal and political organizations, mine included, were busy seeing if we could pivot away from a focus on trans people in the wake of marriage equality. We, as trans people, became the focal point of the political right, but were abandoned by much of the political left and center, which may sound familiar in this current moment. As a consequence, by the end of 2015, the myth of the trans bathroom predator takes hold in our public discourse. And by the beginning of 2016, in state legislative sessions, we saw the first influx of state bills. We saw the first influx of anti-trans bills accompanied by an agile propaganda machine that gained power and efficacy as the media climate shifted. So this was also the rise of social media coinciding with this backlash targeting trans people. And then over the course of the 10 years that followed, we moved from attacks on trans people in restrooms, to locker rooms, to sports teams, to healthcare, back to restrooms, and now with new expanded attacks on healthcare, identification documents, and much more. We got here based on a combination of structural predisposition to systems of violence and movement neglect of more transformative and redistributive change. So now, here we are in this moment. And every time I try to situate what I mean by here we are, I'm like, where are we? What's happening? Because things are rapidly changing, and hopefully in the Q&A we can dig into some of the most immediate things that change every single day. But one thing I know is that it is becoming more and more scary for more and more people. We're in a period of time where half the country bans gender-affirming medical care for trans youth and bans the participation of trans women and girls from women's and girls' sports. We have more anti-trans sports bills and even laws in many states than we have trans athletes. And still, somehow, every January, the same states move to propose new bans on trans participation in athletics. These have no legal effect, just a symbolic one, to tell us again and again that we are not welcome. A fifth of the country bans trans kids in school from using the restroom, while an increasing number of states are banning trans people from all public restrooms that align with our gender identity. Public insurance coverage of our healthcare is slowly being targeted in states across the country. And at the federal level, as we all know, campaign spending leading up to the 2024 elections included hundreds of millions of dollars in anti-trans ad spending with almost no response from Democrats from Harris-Walz down the ballot. Project 2025 forecast the ways in which the Trump administration would situate trans people as inherently fraudulent in order to escalate a renewed effort to criminalize trans life. After Trump announced during his inauguration speech that it would be the policy of the federal government that there are only two sexes determined at conception, obviously, at least a dozen executive orders have implemented that promise, explicitly targeting trans people for discrimination in myriad ways across all areas of federal law, many of which have been greenlit by SCOTUS on their emergency docket. The administration has banned trans, non-binary, and intersex people from accessing accurate federal identification, has cut off healthcare for trans people in the custody of the Bureau of Prisons, has attempted to coerce health institutions to cut off healthcare for trans people under the age of 19, with expanded efforts imminent, and has sought to expel trans people from the military. And of course, the administration is using what is left of the Department of Education to ban trans students from playing sports, going to the bathroom, and accessing safe and inclusive educational environments. These explicitly anti-trans policies are also inextricable from the federal government's assault on protest, on immigrants, on racial justice, on science, and on our public benefit systems. Meanwhile, while the government has been shut down, although not as of today or yesterday, and the judicial and legislative branches have shown that they will not be a check on executive abuses across all areas of law and life. It is all part of a global effort to consolidate power and control among billionaires who seek a community to deem monsters and to lay blame on while they pillage our resources and our sense of possibility. The obvious question that follows is, where are we going? What happens next? Where are we going from here and how could it possibly get worse? I think it is difficult to know exactly where we are going because every day brings new horrors. But as has been true for the last 10 months, we will continue to see attacks on trans people and trans life continue to serve to legitimize expanded executive power. We are anticipating new and sweeping attempts to cut off healthcare access for trans adolescents. We're now forced to contend with the State Department's passport rule after the Supreme Court gratuitously let it go into effect. And the administration, meanwhile, continues to toy with the rhetoric of criminalization, both of trans life and the defense of it. And while these attacks expand from the Trump administration, the pressure on the center and left to abandon trans people has grown. Even in the face of a resounding rejection of candidates fixated on anti-trans rhetoric, trans people remain in the crosshairs of resistance strategies. And even when the federal government does not take explicit action against us as trans people, we and many others are making our lives smaller out of fear of what could happen. The panopticon of Trump's rhetoric and surveillance threats operate as an effective mechanism of broad social control. And this, of course, is happening and will happen alongside mounting efforts to disappear people cast as violent, criminal, or disruptive. All of these attacks on trans people are not a marginal part of the Trump project. They're a necessary component of the larger authoritarian political project we're all being subjected to and are part of constituting. Transness and trans people represent a defiance of the myths that we have been sold about human limits and potential. We have reconstituted the stories of our own lives and uncovered and made visible the possibilities that we as human beings can wield towards a more capacious future. We are therefore the antithesis of an authoritarian project that seeks to make us smaller, less free, and more circumscribed. An authoritarian project necessarily seeks to eradicate queer and transness because of its and our disruptive potential. That means we as queer people will remain under threat, but it also means that we offer a pathway to the future. So what do we do, and what is that pathway? So I spent a lot of time criticizing law and explaining all the ways it's ruining our lives. But I think the first part of the pathway is that we should continue to utilize systems of law and politics as much as we can to reduce harm. And that means continuing our litigation strategies to delay or overcome the deadly governmental incursions into our dignity, our autonomy, and our survival. Those governmental acts at every level that try to limit what we do with our bodies, what we teach to our children, how we move within and across borders, how we organize for our communities to vote and learn and love. However constrained law and politics are as tools for transformation, they remain critically important tools for harm reduction. but we must right-size the efficacy of those tools and remind ourselves that they are not used for liberation, but for harm reduction. And as we engage in that harm reduction project, we cannot proceed with a linear understanding of victory. To win in court is not the end of the story, and to lose is not automatically a material loss for our people. And even when we don't or can't win in the long term, delaying harm and using that delay to build power and share resources is a win, and a win that we must celebrate and leverage. Many of Trump's policies are or were enjoined as a result of litigation, and even when those injunctions are ultimately overturned or stayed, every day that these policies are blocked leaves more room for people to access resources that they need and build resistance strategies that can and will carry us into the future. For me, this part of the strategy, in addition to using litigation, also includes voting in state and local elections and demanding far more from those who purport to lead and govern us. It means pushing our elected representatives to do something and fight. So a few months ago, and this is my favorite interview I was listening to was with Lady Gaga, and in that interview, she said, she's incredulous in her Lady Gaga way. She said, "I'm not in the public eye to stand for absolutely nothing at all," she said. And she does continue to ensure that she is a loud and consistent voice for queer and trans life and power. And so in this strategy, I like to tell myself that our job is to make sure that our elected representatives are out here not standing for nothing at all. Or more simply, make them more like Lady Gaga and less like Chuck Schumer. And when we fight these battles against the federal government, we must not lose sight of the fights in our school districts, in our cities, in our towns, and in our states. And that includes, as well, fights within and against our institutions to prevent them from capitulating to the administration and then playing in our faces, suggesting that they had no other choice or were doing it for us. This is especially true for law firms and universities. We must all commit to getting in the way of our professional institutions and political leaders that are working to align themselves with power. And we must push back on the idea that capitulating to the center somehow leaves more space for electoral success. As we have seen time and time again, the opposite is true. So that's step one. Second, we must be committed collectively to disrupting anti-trans rhetoric wherever we encounter it. In our homes, our schools, our churches, our gay clubs, our knitting circles, wherever. Our opponents have successfully legitimized a debate over trans life, which has been made effective by people's reflexive confusion about and fear of trans people. Every time someone suggests, either explicitly or implicitly, that maybe there are too many trans people, or trans healthcare is not real, or trans women are not women, that starts to erode our safety in deeply material ways. So it is on cis people to intervene in those discursive acts of erasure and attack, because they shift the terrain and then because those attacks shift the terrain, and then they turn into anti-trans legislation and anti-trans court decisions that compromise our survival opportunities. Recently, John Oliver, my favorite thinker, did a piece on trans kids in sports. And I will say, I highly recommend it. And he quite succinctly, I think, explained the problem of ceding an inch when it comes to debating a group's legal rights and basic humanity. This is how he explains it. It does seem like right now, you can say anything you want about trans people, as long as you tag in sports after it. I don't think trans women should be allowed. In sports. I don't think trans women are women. In sports. But it is noticeable just how fast the in sports part can drop off once people feel permission has been granted. This is what we have seen over and over. Just asking questions about sports leads to criminal bans on our healthcare in the span of a year. Our ability to win in court and win in legislatures is dependent on our ability to disrupt this kind of legitimizing of our humanity, of our dehumanization. And as cis people take up their responsibility to do that disrupting, there needs to be space for us as trans people to tell full and nuanced stories about our lives, to provide accurate information about our healthcare, and to remind people that our freedom and liberation is tied up in theirs and yours. The next thing we must do is be redistributive and act outside the state to develop systems of care. This is something that queer people have always done, and I consider it a gift to have learned from the most generous and creative queer organizers and leaders. Part of our task in this moment is to keep each other alive and connected. That means taking what we have, whether it is money, food, medicine, shelter, or a skill, and sharing it. No hoarding of anything. As one example, in 2010, President Obama, you might remember him, it feels like 2,000 years ago at this point, ramped up his secure communities policy that forced cooperation between local law enforcement and ICE. Again, might sound familiar. In New York City, organizers got in the way of this collaboration by showing up at criminal arraignments with cash whenever any trans immigrant was arrested and put into the custody of the New York City Department of Correction and then into ICE custody. Though this did not stop the Obama administration from continuing its efforts to commandeer local resources to enforce draconian immigration policies, it did disrupt that effort by preventing criminalized trans communities from being subject to an expedited removal process. Even in the face of seemingly insurmountable attacks, we can and have pooled resources and created systems for each other outside of the law. We have the tools, and we just have to find the elders who can show us the way and do it now. And finally, and this is my favorite part, we must be bold in our creativity, in our vision, and in our storytelling. As the law gets smaller and more constrained in how it envisions our future, we must dream and build bigger. Creative institutions that nourish our sense of possibility are vital, not just for our political future, but for our survival. When I think about the single most important thing that I do to take care of myself in this time, it is to connect with my community in our shared creative endeavors, and I encourage you to do the same. Turn to the art that makes you feel alive, that cultivates your sense of pain, of grief, of connectedness, and of power. Art will be our greatest source of power, I do believe. As June Jordan says, good poems can interdict a suicide, rescue a love affair, and build a revolution in which speaking and listening to somebody becomes the first and last purpose to every social encounter. Your stories, your words, your art will build our sense of possibility, of freedom, and of disruption. Our creative projects provide the pathways for mapping the futures we want to build. In that work, we center our brilliance and our messiness, our fullness and our history. A successful project of trans liberation and collective liberation engages on the terms that we set for ourselves. Our history as queer people is one of creative action and disruption, and we must not abandon or lose sight of that in moments of despair. And in your disruption, lean into the fear that transness poses. The fear of possibility and of freedom. We as trans people have resisted the imposition of overly determined stories of our lives and bodies and demanded more. And that is our gift to all of you. A reminder to ask yourself if you can realize more magic, more freedom, and more possibility for the contours of your life. And then remember to fight for more. Earlier this year, Miriam Kaba, who's probably the organizer that I trust most in the world to guide my sense of action, posted a quote from Seamus Heaney that I want to leave you with. Heaney says, "Hope is not optimism, which expects things to turn out well, but something rooted in the conviction that there is good worth working for." So whatever happens in the days, months, or years to come, I believe that there is good worth working for, and that our commitment to that good and to each other will carry us through. So make it queer, make it fabulous, make it disruptive. We still have the power. We just have to use it. Thank you.